I really feel at home now. Last year, in February, I gave a series of presentations, and the ambience was so great. And I was encouraged to do it again. As I noted yesterday, a very good friend of mine who's very closely associated with the East Coast, is very much of a Harvard product. And we talked about Stanford. She said, my impression of Stanford is terrific. Stanford can be characterized as excellent scholarship in paradise. This is Stanford. I said, how about Harvard? Excellent scholarship, not in paradise. Yeah, this is in paradise. Yesterday was not. Yesterday was cold and wet. But this is a series of 3 presentations. Actually, I really take advantage of this opportunity to share my still rather tentative ideas. The series is entitled Imagining Confucian Democracy. And a friend of mine said, okay, you have to imagine very hard. As you know, that Lu Xunpai, I mentioned Lu Xunpai, one of the prominent scholar in political science, and in fact, a professor at MIT. His whole area is political culture. And he made a remark in response to a critical reflection I had on democracy. And he said, Confucian democracy is an oxymoron, contradictory in terms. But Sam Huntington, which is also a mutual friend, and even though not a China scholar, insisted that even though it's difficult to imagine Confucian democracy, if the external conditions are right, for example, in Singapore or in Taiwan, soft authoritarianism can become democratic. And in fact, I think Lu Xunpai has been correct in anticipating some of the developments in cultural China, broadly defined in the last 30 years or so. So in my attempt to do this series of Imagining Confucian Democracy, I decided first to offer my own rather personal reflections on the idea of democracy from the Confucian perspective. I did it yesterday, and I received some very good questions. And today I'm going to talk about a very specific topic. The idea is Confucius as an intellectual resource for civil society in cultural China today. And again, many of you may find this really quite extraordinary, if not totally unacceptable. And tomorrow, Francis Fukuyama will give a presentation. Recently, he's been very deeply involved in the study of institutions, especially in the Chinese cultural context. We just had a series of meetings together. I met him in Beijing and invited him for a meeting on Sino-American dialogue on core values. You know, his thick book, a very important part of it is on China. And the recent book, which will be published soon, Confucianism, features very prominently. But his take, of course, is quite different. So he's going to argue there are institutional challenges to the Confucian tradition, even if you want to imagine there's something called Confucian democracy. But today I want to share with you something I find particularly fascinating. I'm still in the process of doing research. So I'm going to make some very general and even sweeping generalizations. I'm not going to I don't feel reluctant to do those general sweeping generalizations in order to provoke some responses from you. On the surface, it is very strange to talk about Confucius. We're talking about historical Confucius, who was born in 551 BC, precisely September 28th, 551 BC. That's Confucius' birthday is now the Teacher's Day in Taiwan, in Singapore, and other places. And I, together with other 13 scholars, proposed 2 years ago that the Chinese Teacher's Day, in other words, Teacher's Day in the People's Republic of China, be changed from September 10, which is a day of no particular significance, to September 28. And first, people felt it was a joke. But recently, I saw the editorial that a formal proposal was made by an important august body, and the Ministry of Education approved. So if everything goes well, this 2013, in this year, the Teachers' Day in China will be changed to September 28th. So it's interesting. But the question I want to address this issue, Confucius as an intellectual resource for civil society in cultural China in the modern times, is actually inspired by a series of very thoughtful observations made by Edward Shears, who's perhaps the leading political scientist of the 20th century in America. Probably I should write down his name, but it's all right. And Shears, S-H-I-R-S. He already passed away. Edward Shears' major concern is the idea of the intellectual. He defined the modern term of intellectual. And of course, Isaac Berlin and a number of others have done the same work. In terms of the idea of a member of the intelligentsia from the Tsarist Russia. In other words, the modern Western idea or the American idea of intellectual came from the Russian idea of a member of the intelligentsia in the 19th century, the Tsarist Russia. There are very specific feature of such a person. That is, if you are an intellectual, you must be a critic. To the extent you have to fight against the establishment, no matter how rational, how humane, how well established the government is. So measures or policies of the government is a defining characteristic of being an intellectual. This is the Russian model. But Edward Shears and others pointed out, this is not the case with all the major European countries. It's not the case with France. We know that Jean-Paul Sartre was very much against the Paris regime, who's intellectual. But some other great scholars like Ahorn, who was very close to Charles de Gaulle. So he's very much a part of the establishment, was also considered as an intellectual. So you don't have to be anti the regime. That's true with Germany. That's certainly true with the United States. You cannot say Henry Kissinger is not intellectual because he's a very close associate of the Nixon administration. So when he was at Harvard, he was an intellectual. When he served in the government, he remained an intellectual. That's also true with many other societies. China, unfortunately, from my point of view, the Chinese intellectuals, under the influence of the Russian model, ever since the founding of the People's Republic, even before, really believed that to be an intellectual, you need to be so critical of the government if you join the government that you've lost your credibility as an intellectual. So that idea of intellectual is very restricted. Whereas in the classical Confucian idea, an intellectual is necessarily politically concerned, socially engaged, and culturally sensitive. So an intellectual is by definition concerned about politics. Often an intellectual ought to be involved in government. Now we know for sure that some of the most articulate intellectuals in the People's Republic of China since 1949 turned out to be high government officials. Li Shenzhi, as many of you know, and certainly Hu Yaobang could be considered as a great intellectual, even though he was really the leader of the regime, and so forth. And Mao Zedong himself was obsessed with the problem of intellectual. He's basically obsessed with two things, with the nationalists, Chiang Kai-shek. The other one is obsessed with the idea of the intellectuals. And there's a story, amusing story, he and Wang Hairong, his niece, try to figure that out. What is the English term for the Chinese idea of 知识分子? So they looked up the dictionary and they decided the intellectual is the one. Anyway, Edward Shears, toward the end of his life, decided to give a seminar on the Chinese intellectual, especially the Confucian intellectual. And he gave the course at the University of Chicago. He's a member of the Committee on Social Thought. probably more than once. In that seminar, that's a semester's course, he elaborated on Confucius. He used one term, Confucius, as the progenitor of the modern conception of civility and civil society. And in fact, I was involved in a number of meetings with him. And in the book I edited, published by Harvard University Press, entitled Confucian Traditions with an S, in East Asian Modernity, the lead article in that collection of essays, basically on education and economic ethics, was Edward Shear's article. So I want to summarize just briefly what he had in mind. Civil society, with emphasis on civility, has three meanings. If it is civil, then it's not barbaric. That's easy. If it is civil, then it's not martial. If it is civil, then it is not official. So the modern idea of civil society, the idea of civility in civil society, has the three connotations. First of all, Confucius emerged as a teacher. And as a teacher, he put a lot of emphasis on the importance of the humanities, now broadly defined humanities. And in so doing, he made it very explicit that his teaching is a teaching of the fine arts, 文行中性. In other words, in literature, in art, in philosophy, in music, or you say the six arts. The only martial art that he considered worth cultivating. He himself came from a martial background because his father was a famous warrior. The only thing that he considered allowable is the art of archery. Because even the art of archery, it is a spiritual self-discipline. It is not simply martial. You know, in the Greek philosophy, the importance of the martial spirit, the Olympics, the warriors, and the muscle man. And all these are very important manifestations of Greek philosophy. Martial spirit is important, but not in the Confucian tradition. This is very clear. The other one that I think Edward Shears was deeply impressed by was that when Socrates taught his students in ancient Hellenistic tradition, basically in Athens, probably 12%, no more than 12% of the population were allowed as citizens. And all the students that Socrates taught turned out to be citizens, children, therefore members of aristocracy. So it's elitist to the core. And in that society, which is really slave society, slaves didn't have any rights whatsoever. And the society was very brutal towards slaves. According to one account, if one slave, by mistake, somehow murdered a citizen, then not only he would be executed right away, but all his relatives and even people associated with him. It's just as harsh as that. So in that society, what Socrates did was to transmit high morality to a tiny group of elite. Look at Confucius. We all know within Chinese history, education began long before Confucius in the Zhou dynasty with all the official schools. But Confucius, the first one who decided to teach outside of the general rubric of officialdom. So the idea is 有教无内, education without class distinction. As a result, there were merchants among his students. Some became very prominent, such as Zigong. There were warriors among his students, such as Zilu, was very much of a warrior. And of course, he even had students who served, and he got out of the prison for political and sometimes for other reasons. And of course, his most beloved student, perhaps the most influential student, was Yan Hui. And in terms of class analysis, you can say he's homeless, right? He's the poorest. Only water and plain rice, nothing else. So poverty-stricken environment. So Confucius disciples came from all kinds of resources, all kinds of angles. So Edward Shears then, using these three examples, whether it's civil or barbaric, whether it's martial or literary, non-martial, humanities, for example, whether it's official or non-official, Confucius, in fact, presented an education for everyone. Now we need to visit the shape of that education a little bit in order to have some appreciation of what happened. And even some of the people who were very critical of the Confucian legacy in China accepted the view that he was powerless, had very little financial resources, and probably not very influential. In other words, he was not the establishment, no matter how you define it. So he began, in this sense, not very different from, say, Jesus or Buddha. Began with a group of people, maybe not 12 disciples, maybe more disciples that had with a little bit of aristocratic background. But most of them were actually common people. And yet, the influence that Confucius eventually exerted upon Chinese culture came from his moral education. And therefore, we can say someone who had no military might, no economic strength, no actual influence, and eventually developed, quote, a soft power through education, through the philosophy of self-cultivation. And these people became not only knowledgeable, but also morally upright, and gradually became influential. So in a few generations, they became so powerful, so influential, they became major advisors to kings, to rulers, and eventually Confucian tradition, as many of you know, became one of the most influential ideologies in traditional China. So this scenario gives you a sense what Edward Shears really had in mind. So we can say, in this sense, he's right in claiming that Confucius as a progenitor, as a major intellectual resource for our idea of civility today. But a civil society in a modern sense is very different. You know, I say Confucius may have been a source of inspiration for the idea of civility, but China has never developed a civil society, which is also a fact to be accepted. A civil society is understood. Earlier, people followed Hegel. The arena above the family and below the state, that's the arena where civil society functions. That's why in Chinese we call it 市民社会. And later the term is used in the broader sense to say 公民社会. But some scholars like Jin Yaoji, Ambrose King, insists that probably the best translation for the Chinese equivalent of the modern civil society is 民间社会. Now, very interesting problem there. I encountered a problem many years ago. In the Great Learning, as you all know, 修身齐家治国平天下 began with the idea of self-cultivation, and then regulation of the family, then governance of the state, then peace all over the world. Now the big question is, from the 家, which is governance of the family, to the 国, which means the state. What happened in the middle? So Ted DeBerry once criticized my interpretation of the Great Learning because I said the important thing is not only to cultivate yourself, to regulate your family, to govern your community, to regulate the states and beyond. And he said, what happened? There's no society. In the 修身齐家治国平天下, 家 and 国. I've been worrying about this for quite some time. Now I realize the idea of 家 in the Confucian tradition is a very comprehensive vision of 家. It's not just the nuclear family. It's an extended family. In other words, the image of family can be extended all the way to the state. And the idea of the state, too, is not simply an organization rises above society. The state penetrates into every aspect of society. But the important thing is to make an empirical observation. The empirical observation is, this has been done not by people in philosophy, but in anthropology, sociology, and other areas. The space between the family, no matter how you define the family, and the state in China, let's say ever since the Han Dynasty, maybe certainly later, after the Tang Dynasty in particular, the space of Chinese society above the family and below the state, so-called the government, the social space is totally filled. In other words, there's no way you can find any gaps. Chinese society is very, very thick, complex in terms of social relationships, social organizations, and social influence. What are some of these institutions that fill the gap? We know from the educational point of view, 社学, communal schools. The communal schools filled everywhere. We call the private academies now. The famous private academies such as Bailudong, such as Songyang, and so forth. That's one. They have all kinds of guilds in the economic sphere. All the merchants form various kinds of guilds we call hui, hang, hui, all kinds of things. Then, more importantly, religious organizations, temples. For example, in medieval China, in the time of Zhu Xi, 13th century, if you travel on foot within a day's journey, you're definitely going to encounter at least a temple somewhere. Just like in California, the early settlers, when they travel on foot or on horseback, within the day's journey, they definitely will find they will definitely find a church community, so they can stay, or some kind of religious organization. So the landscape in China is totally dotted with temples, or even hostels, even motels and hotels. So the landscape, in a way, is rich with all kinds of human activities and institutional organizations. Now, very important to bear in mind that this landscape, we call it urban-rural continuum, the Fritz Mote's idea, urban-rural continuum, is sharply contrasted with what actually happened in Europe. And in Europe, the emergence of the cities, in fact, the word civilization is closely linked to the idea of the cities. And normally, it began with castles. After the collapse of the Roman Empire, all kinds of castles. You move from a castle to another castle. Within the castle is the wilderness, which is very dangerous. Not only highwaymen, but also people believe there are all kinds of devils and spirits. Even priests, when they travel, or nuns, they didn't even dare to lift their eyes up to the trees and so forth. They could be easily tempted or harmed by evil spirits. That's how you move from the other. In China, the landscape is hospitable, right? 游山玩水, you know this idea. You travel around the world. You go to see the mountains, the rivers. Zhu Xi, just give you another example. He actually served as magistrate in Tong'an, which is in Anhui. In the Fujian area. And he had a major debate with Lu Xiangshan in Jiangxi, the so-called Ehu, the Goose Lake debate. Then he went to Hunan to meet with his good friend Zhang Nanxuan and had a long discussion for 3 days on Daxue. This is in Changsha. And then he went to Zhejiang with Lü Zuqian, with Chen Dongpu, all these people. So he's not a regional thinker. He's a national, cosmopolitan thinker. In the 13th century, he traveled all over the place. So that's the landscape. Now, the Confucian idea of education is learning to be human. Learning to be human is not simply understood as the acquisition of knowledge, which is important, nor is simply the internalization of skills, professional skills. Internalization skills or acquisition of knowledge are important. Right now, of course, major universities all over the world simply focus on these two areas. There's something else that is character building. This is what we hope the humanities can do, is to build up one's character. You can, if you use a very fashionable term today, Confucian education is education of the leader. And the assumption is a person who is more powerful, more influential, have more access to information, ideas, ought to feel more obligated for the well-being of the community as a whole. So the idea is to educate those people who came from all kinds of backgrounds, but to give them an opportunity to develop themselves. First of all, for the sake of themselves. They didn't go there to study for their parents, to study simply for society or for careers. Confucius insisted they study for themselves, to build up their characters as a basis for serving society as leaders. This is the whole idea of 士. And later, of course, we have 士君子. I think this is the notion of 士. And this notion, 士 has often been translated as the literatus, correctly. But it's more than literatus, because 士 also, you have the Japanese bushido, right? That's the martial spirit actually became compatible with Confucianism because of the Japanese Confucianism, not Chinese Confucianism, Japanese Confucianism. So this idea of the 士 as an intellectual is someone who is socially responsible, engaged, and culturally sensitive. That's what Confucius would consider as the model of the modern idea of the intellectual. So we can make the following observation. If you want to find historically, in a comparative perspective, you want to find precedents of the modern conception of an intellectual, especially of a public intellectual. When I say a public intellectual, I make a distinction between a public intellectual and an expert in some endeavors, whether in the humanities or social sciences. A public intellectual is, by definition, politically concerned. It's not possible to imagine someone who is called a public intellectual and yet politically totally uninterested in any kind of power, influence, or these ideas. Otherwise, the role of the public intellectual would be very different. And also very much engaged in society. This idea of the public intellectual is very different from the classical Greek idea of philosopher. A philosopher is a thinker, and also an elitist thinker. Perhaps the most revealing example is Plato's idea of this cave. All of us in the cave, facing one direction, chained, with no vision of reality. Only the philosopher is able to see what's outside of the cave. And yet the philosopher with that vision of the outside cave cannot transmit that knowledge to any of us because he had no way. The only way the philosopher, if he's compassionate enough, is to take us out of the cave, to lead us to a different vision. Normally the philosopher is not interested in doing that at all. And so the philosophers have this vision. So if you look at the relationship between Socrates and students, we use the term dialogue, which is strictly speaking is not dialogue at all. It's what Socrates has already embodied truths of various kinds, including the capitalized truth. And the students are ignorant. So Socrates will try to shock the student out of their ignorance, lead them step by step from limited understanding of truth, partial, distorted understanding to a better understanding. So this is what Socrates is doing. Socrates knows exactly where to go. None of the students really know how to do it, and Socrates will lead the students out. Confucius' relationship to his students turned out to be dialogical. Not that they all belong to the same kind of knowledge level, that's not the case, but all of them endowed with the same nature and even the same intelligence. So Confucius made it very clear, there are those people who are born with knowledge, like the sage kings. Now, maybe only one in 500 years, so don't worry too much about them. And these people don't have to study, they know. But I'm not one of them. There are also those people, no matter how hard you try to teach them, they never learn. The 下愚, again, maybe 1 of a million. So these people don't care. Most of us are in the middle. Some learn with facility, some learn with difficulty, some learn with a kind of painful struggle. But if you learn, you become enlightened. All of us are in that situation. So Confucius is trying to say, these are the things that we need to learn, and through dialogical interactions. Therefore, even though Confucius responded to many of the questions, almost asked the final word, asked what is humanity? Humanity means love people, so that's his instruction. But we have to know that the exchange, any exchange in the Analects, presupposes a very long and complicated dialogical interaction, because he knew his students. There must have been numerous interchanges. So the recorded conversations give you a sense of the dynamism of the dialogical interaction going on. That's the 人语, right? So that's a dialogical interaction. So the modern intellectual, in a way, is very different from the classical Greek idea of the philosopher. That's one of the problems fellow philosophers or people who teach philosophy suffer. Because if you're a good philosopher, if your philosophy is being understood by your colleagues, then there must be something wrong with you, right? Because your philosophy should be sophisticated enough that a lot of people don't understand. So that kind of elitism is built into the philosophical enterprise. Now, it's not the Greek prophet, not the Judaic prophet. The prophet knows something that we do not know. And the prophet will have to use the ordinary language to transmit his prophetic vision to the multitude. But that's not the modern sense of intellectual. Not a priest in the Christian sense, or the monk in the Buddhist sense, or a guru in the Hindu sense. Because if you talk about, say, Gramsci's notion about organic intellectual, what he has in mind is that the people who are all workers, and they have a higher level of consciousness, they become more concerned about what's going on, and they are able to transmit their knowledge to every one of us, because every one of us is gifted with that possibility. So the only example, I don't want to be too exclusive, the only example that's Edward Shear's argument too, about the modern intellectual, not prehistorical, in the axial age civilization traditions, is the Confucian idea of the literatus. That's the modern sense of an intellectual. Not the Greek philosopher, not the Judaic prophet, not the Christian priest, not the Buddhist monk, not the Hindu guru. So that's why we have to take this tradition very seriously about the resource. Of course, for those people who are in the Chinese culture area, this is even more important, to be aware of this legacy. The legacy, it's a civil tradition based upon education, especially moral education. Very rational, but it's not simply instrumental rationality. The rationality there is based upon not calculation, but based upon the sense of human flourishing. Now, it's not a totally surprising, even though if I point this out, you may find this is outrageous, that the Enlightenment movement of the West, which probably began in the 18th century, 17th, 18th century, in Paris, in Europe first, but then of course in Germany, in England, and later in the United States. When the tradition emerged, we know it was basically against Christendom. This is our idea about moving from the medieval Christian, not superstitious, that's Karl Marx's notion, sort of Christian tradition eventually into the modern, in the modern period, based upon rationality. Therefore, the idea of enlightenment, you become enlightened. A very important distinctive feature of the Enlightenment is against Christendom, using the modern term, against Catholicism. The infallibility of the Pope, the dictatorial power of the Church, the authoritarianism of the priest, and the non-negotiable nature of all the doctrines. So each of the great Enlightenment thinkers reacted against this kind of the Catholic vision of the world. Of course, Martin Luther was the major contributor to this process. As you know, for 1,000 years, maybe even longer, for 1,000 years, no one not educated in Europe ever suspected the thesis that there's only salvation through the Church. The great theologians, Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine, all these great minds, no one suspected that's the only way out. That's why the Pope was so powerful. Christendom was so powerful. Only when Luther began to say, well, we can be saved through faith, not the Church. And that became such an explosive change. Now, if you put that, in comparative studies, sometimes it's just amazing. You put that question into the Chinese cultural area. God's existence was by far the most important theological issues for all the major thinkers in Europe, or theologians in Europe. And yet God's existence, not even, I used to, a rejected possibility in the Confucian tradition. Nobody ever worried about God's existence. Confucius was not worried about it. Mencius, all the major Confucian thinkers, none of them even imagine, they don't know what God it really, the term, symbol of God itself is not a very important issue. That's why Maharishi, when he wanted to promote Christianity to China, tried so hard to develop this idea of Sangdi. But anyway, that's something very, very important to bear in mind. In one culture, the most brilliant minds were focused or obsessed with one problematique. In another culture, not even a rejected possibility. So when these Enlightenment thinkers began to question fundamentally about the rationality, the significance of God's existence, of in the God-centered universe based upon the power of the Church, they became fascinated by Confucianism. There's no question about that. Now, Confucian texts, all the classics, became available through Maharishi and his colleagues' translations, the Jesuit translations. So all of course, first translated into Latin. And so everybody read. Now, I'll give you some examples. This is one project I'm doing now. The project is simply to study what I call the Confucian elements in the Enlightenment thinkers of the modern West. We're not talking about Confucian influence. Many of these issues are highly controversial. But it's simply to ask people to identify the so-called Confucian elements. And some really marvelous research results have come to light in the last 20 years now. Look at Voltaire, the most important Enlightenment thinker. And in Paris, of course. Voltaire was so alienated. He was exiled. He couldn't live in Paris. It's very difficult. He had to align himself with Catherine the Great in Russia, so forth. Voltaire was just overwhelmed by the Confucian mode of thinking. And there's one scholar at Peking University. Her name is Meng Hua, and she just retired, but she received 3 major prizes from the French government, almost a functional equivalent of being knighted 3 times in England, and for her work on Voltaire. So she actually now come up with a TV series called Confucius in Paris, and it's a very detailed study of how obsessed Voltaire really is. None of the modern Western scholars ever looked into that material. They just talk about Voltaire as if Voltaire suddenly emerged with the with incredible inspiration from somewhere. But Voltaire was just obsessed with the Confucian mode of thinking. He wanted to come to China. He wanted to went to China. And he even designed what we call the business deal. And he asked the Catherine to help to sell. He said China of course doesn't want anything, right? We know that because silk, tea, and China, for example, or handicrafts and so forth. But they needed watches. They needed watches and all kinds of gadgets. So he developed a big plan to sell watches to China and wrote 3 letters to Qianlong. Qianlong didn't respond. He was very unhappy about that. But the person we should know is Kenny, the physiocrat, who believed that all the values came from the cultivation of the land. Kenny in Chinese or Kui Na. He put Confucius' portrait in his study. And Voltaire, the reason why the Menghua study is convincing, normally a ritual, this is a secular ritual, it's not a Christian ritual. The secular ritual is every year you cut the new grain from harvest the new grain, you present it to your hero. That's the most important ritual because you're no longer part of the Christian world of presenting this to God. And he always did it to Confucius. So that's why the identification. But the more important thing is about Kenny. Then we have this encyclopedist, Diderot. Diderot in his encyclopedia, there was a very strong argument. There's one argument in Europe that's very interesting. Many scholars now only became interested in that argument. The argument is why China and to a certain extent Japan developed this prohibition. Didn't allow Europeans to be there. So they were very surprised. And Diderot actually argued in China's favor. He said, well, they look at the Europeans, just like many of the Europeans now look at China. And these people are not educated. These people are rude. These people are not civilized. So from the Chinese point of view, why should they allow all these barbarian Europeans to go? So that's the argument in favor of China's position. But anyway, there are all kinds of interesting discussion. But Christian Wolff, another very important thinker, and believed that we really have to study Confucianism. And Leibniz, we know Leibniz, my first PhD thesis at Berkeley, is David Mangello. He did his thesis on Leibniz and Confucianism, and he got a humble fellowship to go to Germany and study Leibniz for 2 years. And Henry Rosemont, because the famous book that Leibniz did called Novissima Sinica. Novissima Sinica basically is the study of Confucianism. And he even proposed that China send missionaries to educate Europeans about the Chinese way of thinking. So that's Leibniz, of course, was a great philosopher. Normally, I knew, for a number of years, I knew that in Paris, it's very important, and also to a certain extent in Germany. But I didn't know in the what we call the Scottish Enlightenment, which is based upon Edinburgh, had anything to do with this. But recently, there's a study by Luo Weidong, who's the leading expert on Adam Smith. He's a professor at Zhejiang University. And he talked about, normally we associate Adam Smith with his Wealth of Nations because he's the father of economics. But we all know that Adam Smith never felt that the most important contribution he made was the Wealth of Nations, but also always the theory of moral sentiments. So he considered himself as a moral philosopher. And because his communication with the French intellectuals, his idea is very, very Confucian in a broad sense, very Confucian. And Lowy Dong, in order to show that Adam Smith indeed considered his theory of moral sentiments much more important than the Wealth of Nations, and visited Adam Smith's tomb in Edinburgh. There, that's his own epitaph. Here lies the author of a theory of moral sentiments. And that's probably true with David Hume. But anyway, we can say for sure that in that period, that the European intellectuals, the French, the German, and the British, were all fascinated by this whole question. We can say, in Edward Shear's sense, what is the idea of the Confucian literatus, an intellectual? What's the meaning of that? So, if that can serve as a background, we don't want to exaggerate the case, to serve as a background, at least an important reference. The most recent book by Jonathan Israel, called Enlightenment Contested. Enlightenment Contested is probably the most comprehensive work. He's now the professor at the Princeton Advanced Institute, and this aspect has been greatly expanded. And we know the intellectuals in Europe were very, very cosmopolitan. They're fascinated by China, have demonstrated, but fascinated by India, fascinated by the Islamic world, and also fascinated by the New World. That's not just the European settlers in America, but Native Americans. They're just fascinated by the world outside of Europe, unlike the parochial Europe that emerged after the Second World War, especially the parochial America today, as many of you pointed out. America today is not interested in any civilizations outside of the modern West. It's a new phenomenon. So 18th century or 19th century was the turning point, because 19th century Europe became so powerful, industrialization, democratization, and the incredible development of science and technology, that Europe move ahead and believe that there's no need to learn anything from the West and anything from outside of the West. And then China, since the Opium War of mid-19th century, became obsessed. That's the only way to be modern, to be civilized, to be a part of the international world, is to learn from the West. The situation is very, very fascinating. But even at the time of the Opium War, on the eve of the Opium War, we talk about 1839, the Chinese economy is comparable to, maybe superior to, the American economy in the world today. In other words, 20%, 17 to 20% of world economy. And the two-way trade between China and England, of course, the most powerful country, was totally in China's favor. As I pointed out, China didn't want anything from England, but England wanted a lot. That's why the legalization of opium, and you know that, the flow of silver and so forth. So that's only in the 150 or 60 years before. So now we enter into a new situation. I want to end with just a simple observation. It's more speculative than anything that I stated so far. If we look into the future, and with this whole question about the Confucian legacy as the background, what is the strength of this tradition, the Confucian tradition? Hopefully that it will become more widely recognized and considered more important in cultural China. First of all, I want to digress just a little bit. Among the Axial Age civilizations, these major human spiritual traditions that emerged, according to Karl Jaspers, in the 6th century BC or before, specifically ancient Greece, and in the Middle East, Judaism eventually later evolved into Christianity and Islam, and the Hindu tradition, and of course China, with Confucianism and Taoism. In the Axial Age civilizations, all the major Axial Age civilizations has gone through what may be called a transcendental breakthrough. The transcendental breakthrough, for example, in the Judaic tradition, the emergence of the idea of Yahweh, of God, In the Greek tradition, the emerging idea of logos. In the Indian tradition, the idea of Brahman. And of course in China, Tian and Di and so forth. But in all the other traditions, there's a clear break. In other words, the emergence of an order of meaning, of order that's totally different from the lived world here now. So the Christians eventually develop up to this day, the kingdom of God yet to come. That's where our human ultimate concerns ought to be focused on. Not the world here now. The world here now is just the Caesar's world. It's God's world. It's different from Caesar's world. That's transcendental breakthrough. In the Greek philosophy, a clear distinction between the secular and the sacred, between the spiritual and the material. In the Buddhist tradition, following the Hindu tradition of Brahman and Atman, is the pure land, which is beyond, and the world here now. So all these clear distinctions, I call it dichotomous mode of thinking. We are so much seasoned by these ideas. Now we think if it is spirit, then it's not matter. So spirit and matter, mind and body, sacred and profane. Certainly soul and flesh. All these are very clearly dichotomized. But in the Confucian tradition, we know in the great learning and so forth, the dichotomies are not exclusive dichotomies, but they are complementary or inclusive dichotomies. In the great learning, what are some of these dichotomies? The dichotomy is 本和末, is the root and the branch. So you have to have the root and the branch together. You have 先后, formal, latter. You have 左右, you have 上下. You have also 深浅, surface, depth. So each one of them is complementary. And of course, the overall conception as we know it is the yin-yang model. It's not possible to imagine this pure yang without yin, or pure yin without yang. There's always yin in the yang, and yang in the yin of the yang, and so forth. There's always complementary and conflictual. So the model, I would call it, it's not a linear progressive model, it is a complex model. I'll give you one example. This often a misunderstanding of the reasoning in the great learning. That is, you cultivate yourself, then you regulate the family, then you govern the state, then you move to the world peace. As if some kind of A to B to C to D, which is totally wrong. The thinking is this. From A to B, when you get to B, A, because of B, becomes much more complicated. When you get to C, both A and B, because of C, become even more complicated. So it's a complex model. Let's say self-cultivation. 修身. When you get to the family, it doesn't mean you've already done your 修身, you now to regulate your family. That's ridiculous, because in the family, let's say the simplest family with 3 people, or let's say 5. And because of the family is structured in such a way, there's a gender differentiation, there's age differentiation, there's a power differentiation, there's status differentiation, and authority differentiation. So it becomes infinitely more complex. Now in the family, whether you say 3 or 5, each member is both an integral part of a complex system or relatively independent. And each member of the family has to behave properly. There's no way, if there's one person within this structure of 3 or 5 doesn't want to collaborate, the other people will be able to do it. So it becomes much, much more complicated. The Confucians take the family absolutely seriously, not because this romantic idea the family is warm, family is always supportive. Abusive family is fully appreciated by the Confucian tradition. The best example would be the example he mentions about Sun, the sage king. Gu Shou was perhaps a brutal guy, was a brute fellow, so not a kind father. The mother, Ji Mu, totally irresponsible. And his half-brother just wanted to get rid of him all the time. So asked him to fix the well. Then they put stones, pour stones. Asked him to fix the roof, then get rid of the ladder and set the house on fire, right? This is not a warm family. And so, but the family is absolutely critical as a social unit, because you cannot, as human beings, you cannot grow by going away or by way of some other paths without implicating the family. And of course, the family has to be understood variously. Not what we call the normal family. Now, I think according to the UN, there are 5 different families. Each one of them is absolutely critical for our human flourishing. So this is the context. So the Confucian tradition, that ever since the axial age, is secular to the core. Not secular may not be the right word. It's to accept the world here and now as irreducible. So there's no transcendental breakthrough. As a result, this is, well, I feel reluctant to do that, but I can say in the Confucian tradition, there's no dogma. In other words, whether you're talking about a personality, a doctrine, an institution, anything you talked about concerning Confucianism is discussable, debatable, falsifiable, certainly negotiable. So first of all, the important things about Confucius, perhaps the most important in the Confucian tradition. Now, Confucius definitely is not the founder of Confucianism, right? Unlike Buddha. You cannot think of anyone who's more Buddhistic than Buddha, or anyone who's more Christian than Jesus Christ. But you can think a lot of people who are much more Confucian than Confucius. And even the word Confucian is a misnomer, right? Because we call it Rujia. Now, in this case, Duke of Zhou, probably superior to Confucius. The King Wen was superior to Duke of Zhou. The Yao Sun probably superior to King Wen. So no one could be considered as the paradigmatic example of the Confucian personality. No institution. So filial piety is the most important. That's in China. In Japan, it's loyalty. And I say the core value, for example, I insisted that the core value of Ren is the most important idea in Confucianism. But most of my colleagues in the West insisted that it's Li. By the way, you know how the Ren should be written? The Ren should be written this way. The body on top, the mind on the back. It's a major, if you get on the web, you know there's a major debate. I'm involved in this debate. It's from the Ma Wang Dui, not from the Guodian material. But anyway, there's inner morality. But there's a lot of debate. So nothing in the Confucian tradition is not debatable. Okay, so there's no dogma. So now the big question. Can we, the big question is, I've been involved over the last 10 or 15 years, many kinds of dialogues. The Confucian Buddhist dialogue, the Confucian Christian dialogue, Confucian Muslim dialogue, not just the Hui, but also the Uyghurs, the Confucian Judaic dialogue, and so forth. So, I'll give you one example as an illustration. The first time I was involved in the Confucian Christian dialogue, I was in Hong Kong, and actually at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. 13 Confucian representatives and 13 Christians. And it's a one-week dialogue. On the fourth day, I discovered more than half of my fellow Confucians, they're also Christians. Many of them are famous, right? You know Teddy Berry, Julia Ching, and Bob Neville, John Bertrand. If it happened, just imagine it happened between the Christian and the Muslim dialogue. You know, it would be very serious. Or the Christian and Buddhist dialogue. But for me as a Confucian, I'm not a Christian, or Confucian Christian. I'm a non-Christian Confucian. And I was overjoyed. And so I've been thinking that dialogue was not only a Confucian Christian dialogue, but also a Christian Christian dialogue. As a Christian-to-Christian dialogue, there's something we can call Confucian Christians. And in fact, Julia Ching identified herself as a Confucian Christian, de Barry and Bob Neville and John Berthel. First, I just considered it's very good, but I didn't think deeply. Now I've reflected upon it. Is there a difference between a Confucian Christian and non-Confucian Christian? Now, there are many, many Christians that are not Confucian. For example, your qualification to be a Christian is your relationship to God. And a Christian can say, I'm not interested in politics. I'm not interested in society. I'm not even interested in culture. I'm only interested in my faith. And my faith, the authenticity of my faith in reference to my law. But that person is not a Confucian Christian. If you're a Confucian Christian, you have to be politically concerned, socially engaged, and culturally sensitive. Is it possible to imagine a Confucian Buddhist? Of course. A Confucian Buddhist ought to be an engaged Buddhist. Ought to be what now in Taiwan they call it 人间佛教. So in this case, then the word Confucian can become an adjective. If it becomes an adjective, which I will conclude, which means that it's perhaps in the intercivilizational dialogue, this is a very important reference for all religious people. And yet, the precondition, which is very difficult, the precondition is for the Confucian tradition itself to recognize its own historicity, its historical background. The Confucianism now is being understood and practiced by scholars in China and others would not be able to assume this incredible responsibility because Confucianism is understood very feudalistic, very patriarchal, male-oriented, dictatorial, authoritarian, and so forth. The most important thing for me is to recognize what may be called the spiritual dimension of Confucianism, which on the surface is the irony. Its strength is because it's not one of those spiritual traditions. But if it's simply a kind of secularism, like Marxism, or like atheism, also the Confucian tradition would not be a good conversation partner with any religious traditions. I was given an award by, I know Stanford now recently established it, but Harvard is, it's a ecumenical spirit. This is called the humanist chaplaincy. And Stanford just established the first humanist chaplaincy, Mr. John Elger. Anyway, he's from Harvard Divinity School. I was given the lifelong award, as a Confucian. It's recommended by Edwin Wilson and Amartya Sen. These are two great minds, humanist minds. And Simon Rushdie was asked to give a talk. So it's 800 or so humanists all over the world gathered for the celebration in Cambridge, at Hyatt Auditorium. Actually, I was asked to give a speech. So the first line, Confucianism is not a secular humanism. I was afraid that half of the audience would just disappear, because it's not. An Indian scholar, Balasubramania, recently, very, very persuasive to me, argues that Confucianism should be understood as a spiritual humanism, because the emphasis on the idea of heaven, a sense of awe. In traditional Chinese culture, and under the influence of Confucianism, we have a number of sacred values. And normally it's called天地君亲师. Now some people want to translate 君to国, but anyway, 天地君亲师. The reverence for this community is heaven, which is the source of all inspiration, earth, which means nature, to the nation, to the parent, and to your own teacher. So you always have a sense of awe towards the world. So the spirit of reverence is very, very important in the Confucian tradition. Now in China, this is gone. There's no spirit. 天斗地斗人斗, you don't have any respect for anything else, which is extremely dangerous. Now, with a sense of reverence, it is in this context, I think we all know that one great legacy of the Confucian tradition in China is that the coexistence of all three teachings. Not only coexistence, but mutually influencing, mutually appreciating. And now I think we need to talk about five traditions, not just Ru Shi Dao, also Christianity and Islam. So you have a tradition which is able to enter into communication with many other traditions without losing sight of its own identity. A group of scholars in comparative religion right now, I think I've argued very forcefully, they accepted the view that all religious traditions in the world today will have to develop two languages. One, for example, they just use Christianity and Buddhism as an example. As a Christian, there's a language that is unique to the Christian experience. Trinity. If not Trinity, at least God's existence, Christ as a Savior, as the only Son of God, and the Virgin Mary, resurrection. Now, if you may question some of them, if you question all of them, the possibility for you to remain a Christian is highly problematic. For someone to be a Buddhist, the idea of renhui, transmigration, the idea of nirvana, highest, the idea of emptiness, the idea of dharma, the idea of karma, these are absolutely critical for you to become a Buddhist. These two linguistic systems are not compatible. That's why it's difficult to imagine someone who is a Christian Buddhist or Buddhist Christian. For that matter, a Jewish Christian or a Christian Muslim or Islamic Jew, even though some kind of fusion is going on. It's difficult to imagine. So in this case, that each religious tradition, in order to preserve its own identity, will have to advocate and repeat, reiterate time and time again the core of your belief. But at the same time, Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, and all the other traditions will have to develop another language, which is the language of global citizenship. And this language is critical because without this language, we cannot deal with the ecological issues, with issues threatening the human community, financial crisis, all these other issues. So you need to have another language. The language of global citizenship, the language of Shi. And the Confucian tradition has only one language. That's the language of Shi. So this may sound outrageous, but I think it's important to bear in mind. That's my argument. You have to choose to become a member of a religious group. Maybe you're born as a Christian, but you need to conscientiously go through the ritual, say, I am a Christian, or I am a Buddhist, or I am a Muslim. It's a conscientious choice. It's very important. That defines who you are. But you have no choice but be learning to be human. So whether you like it or not, you're in the world defined by the Shi and others. This is the world in which we live in. Because no Christian leader today can afford to say, look, the kingdom of God yet to come is more important than the mundane world, so let's pollute it. No Buddhist leader can afford to say, the Pure Land is what we look for. The world is basically the red dust, so let it be polluted. Let it be polluted. No one can say that. Because only in our generation, for the first time in human history, that we with our naked eye manage to see the good earth. We become the first generation in human history aware of the vulnerability of the mineral, of the water, of the air, and so forth. But the Confucian tradition, ever since its inception, accepted it as an undeniable fact of life. Okay, thank you.